I'm happy to be able to spend some time talking about bits with you. And I know that there's probably a few of you here who think, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to learn about the magic bit, right? And we're going to solve all the problems. My goal for each of you out of this presentation tonight is that we've created a level of awareness as it relates especially to horse welfare, why bit fitting is so important. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why I feel very passionate about why bit fitting is a very big part of what we do with taking care of horses and a big part of the whole support system. And I'm happy that more and more people are realizing that, and it's becoming a very regular part of their whole support program. You know, I work closely with Melissa and up here on a pretty regular basis working with her horses. So it's not a one and done. It's something that, you know, like your saddle, you need to be having rechecked, and bits change as the horses change, and I'll get into why that happens. So I have literally a brand new computer. This is the first file I put on it. So if I'm a little funny with how this is working, that's why. So my background is different. I came at this as a trainer, fascinated with equipment. I'd go to Europe and come back with suitcases full of all kinds of fun stuff. And I felt that this was an area that really wasn't being addressed well in this country. My background besides riding is business. I was a brand manager for quite a few years in consumer packaged goods and did a lot of marketing, strategic planning, and product innovation. So I'm wired a little bit that way. And I was always like, where's the opportunity here? And that's when I got into bit fitting, and it's taken over my life. I used to have a pretty big training barn, and I don't have the time for that now. I have my own horses that I train and compete. And like what was said in the intro, I've competed up through Grand Prix and ridden on 3 Nations Cup teams for Australia down in Wellington, and spent time in Europe as well training and showing. So I come at it from a rider and trainer perspective. And whenever I work with clients, the first thing I say is, don't tell me anything. Let me watch. Just like I was getting ready to start to teach a lesson. Let me watch, let me get a baseline, and let's go from there. So with that, let's move into where we're at. So my bidding philosophy, again, coming from a trainer's background, is that the bit fitting is one piece of it, right? And this is, I think, where I'm different. Like, to me, the bit itself is 50% of the equation. The other 50% of the equation is the training, the rider's skill set, the rider's seat, how the rider is in the connection. There's a lot of complexity when you start talking about bit fitting. And oftentimes, if the trainer's the one doing the riding, I'm going to put the horse in a different bit versus when the owner's riding. Again, just depending on the skill level. But I want you all to, like, I want this burned in everybody's heads, burned on your brain, that the bit is a piece of it, the training is also another big piece of it. And when I'm fitting bits, I approach it from the standpoint of I want to open the door. I don't necessarily want to be solving the problem, because if I'm going that far with a bit, it's probably going too far with the bit. And then 2 weeks later, I'm going to get the phone call. Okay, this is now a problem. The horse is backed off, or it's not going well. So like I said, it's a piece of the puzzle. We've got training, we've got the bridle fit, and the bridle is as important as the bit. And we're not going to have time to really talk about bridles, but maybe that's something we can do in the future. Because bridles are putting pressure on the horses' heads. So I've seen horses change dramatically as much as they've changed with a bit. The third one is a big one that I see, and that's sometimes horses have subclinical lameness issues that are showing up as mouth issues. And sometimes I'll send the horse off, you know, okay, let's go back to the vet, let's get a thorough workup done. And oftentimes we'll find something, oh, yeah, there's a problem in the front feet, or there's a problem in the back. So again, we have to be looking at this in a very holistic manner and not just isolating on a particular bit in the horse's mouth. Saddle fit, that's another big one. Oftentimes the saddle gets changed, the horse is different in its mouth. So we have to then adjust the bit. So it's this constant, you know, figuring out things backwards and forwards to get that balance right. Other health issues. You know, sometimes there's things going on in the horse's system that we can't see, that when you dig into a little bit further, you find out there's something else going on with the horse. And the last one, oh my God, the rider. It could never be the rider, right? But it's just, you know, sometimes that's what's going on. So just wanted everybody thinking about these things. So why is bit fitting so important? It's become very, very popular to get bit fittings done. I mean, everybody's jumping in it. We've got saddle fitters out there doing it. You know, everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. But I think it takes a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise to be able to do it the right way. But the most important thing is the welfare of the horse. Our sport, whether it's dressage or eventing or show jumping, is under tremendous scrutiny right now. And I think it's really important that we're doing whatever we can to make sure these horses are healthy and they're happy and we're not causing injuries. And I'll show you some photos a little bit later that really highlight that. And then also the performance of the horse. You know, the mouth is a very sensitive area. The tongue is a muscle. And I'll show you some pictures in a little bit that show you why that's important and how those muscles all connect through the body. And I've seen horses many times where we change the bit and somebody's walked out of the arena and they come back in and they go, oh, that's a different horse. Because suddenly now we've freed up a muscle and then the horse is able to work better and move better through its body. So it can be a pretty dramatic and impressive change. Not all the time. Remember, there's no magic bit. Okay, so what are we going to cover tonight? We're going to start with anatomy and how that impacts bit fitting. So just a brief overview of that. We'll talk a little bit about how bits work. We'll talk about the types of bits and then the common materials that are used now for bits, because that's really changing too. And then we'll just do a little bitting 101, just to give you all some basic knowledge. So first, when it comes to anatomy, sorry, I don't have a pointer here with me tonight, but let's just get some basic landmarks down. So if you look at A, the front of the teeth, I mean, obviously, you know, the front of the mouth, that's where the incisors are. The B is where the molars are. You know, we're not going to be interfering with any of that kind of anatomy. The thing that's really important is if you look at D, that's the space where the bit is going to sit. Okay, and oftentimes, especially now with the more modern bred horses, that space is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And the breeders are producing these lovely, beautiful modern sport horses with these little pretty teacup noses. And then you open their mouth and you're like, how are we going to get bits in there? Let alone, you know, one bit, but what about a double bridle for us in dressage? Like, where do we put it? So that space, so the height is important, and then the length between the end, where the first molar, the premolar is, and then C is where a lot of horses are going to have a canine tooth. Mares normally don't have them, or they have little ones. The geldings typically will have them, stallions will have them. So that space can be not a whole lot of room. And we don't want bits to be clanking against any of those teeth. And this is just looking at it down on the lower jaw. The important thing here is E, which is the bars. And can I tell you how many times I say to people, oh, your horse has sharp bars, and they say, well, the dentist was just here. So, yeah, that's just his anatomy. We can't do anything about it. It just is what it is. Okay, so that's the important thing there is E, which is the bars, but also, okay, so this is one of the things I like to do in my lectures. I want you all to hold up your hands, fingers. How many fingers do we all have? Look at the person next to you. The next time you see that person, make sure they have the same number of fingers, okay? Because you're all going to go and start sticking your fingers in your horse's mouths now, okay? So okay, so what I want you to do, your first exercise when you go and see your poor horse tomorrow and you start sticking your fingers in, I want you to take your thumb and I want you to put it under the tongue, okay? Right where the bit would be sitting, but under the tongue. Just go underneath, and I want you to note how narrow that space is, okay? Because you look at the horse straight on, right? And the muzzle's what, about that wide? So you assume that's how wide the jaw is. When you put your thumb under the tongue, feel the two ridges, which are the bars, and it's only going to be about as wide as the end of your thumb to the first knuckle. Okay? It's much, much narrower. That's important when we start talking about double jointed bits, which have lozenges in the middle. And you see a lot of these big lozenges. Well, guess where those joints are now sitting right over the top of where the bars are, pushing the tongue down onto the bar. So that's one piece of it that we need to really take into consideration. The other thing is if you're using a double bridle and your curb is too big, it now starts rocking on those bones. So we don't want that. So we want the bits fit a little bit more snug, a lot more snug than they were in the past. Okay, this is just showing you just an illustration of the tongue and how big the tongue is and how it kind of hangs over the bars. And you see a lot of horses, especially now, the more modern bred horses, like I mentioned, these big tongues that just kind of ooze out everywhere when you peel the lips back.
Is that because they've been bred to have such small...
Yes. Yeah. And they've put some Arab blood back in, and they're producing these pretty, pretty faces. And, you look at the modern dressage horses, right? They're beautiful. Very elegant, very leggy, much more fine bone structure than what we were riding 25 years ago, the big old rectangular tanks that we were riding. So yes, that's a good point. So now we get into the issues. So we start with palate shape and height. Palate is the roof of the mouth. It's got, I'll show you in a minute. So the height is really important. That's probably the most limiting factor when it comes to bit fitting is the shape and the height of the palate. If the horse has got a low palate and a thick fleshy palate and not much height between the upper and lower jaw, it becomes more difficult to fit them. Because again, they just don't have any space. Okay, pop quiz. What's more mild, a thick bit or a thin bit? Okay, who says thick? Who says thin? Okay.
I have a question before you answer. Doesn't it depend on how big the tongue is, how much space is in there?
Yes. Okay. So for those of you who didn't hear me, what my question was, what's more mild, a thick bit or a thin bit? And the answer is exactly that. It depends on the horse, but in general, the thinner the bit's thinner versus the 20 millimeter big fat things that we used to like to use. There's not enough room to accommodate them, so they're squashing the tissue down in the mouth. The tongue, we've got these huge tongues in these little mouths. That's an issue. The bars, I'll talk about them. The TMJ, we get dentists who like to take too much tooth off, right? Especially back in the molars, they take too much off. Horse can't close its mouth, or it has to really strain the TMJ now to close its mouth. Now we end up with a horse that's got TMJ issues for a year or 2 or 3, depending on how long it takes for those teeth to grow back. And there's nothing we can do about it. Damage to the cheeks, lips, and also the corners of the mouths. And I'll show you some pictures of some stuff that can happen there from the bits. And also, what I see a lot with off-the-track thoroughbreds, they'll have a scar on their tongue from a tongue tie. I see that a lot, unfortunately. What else have we got? Bone spurs. I see them way, way too often. That's where on the bar, there's some roughness that's been caused from the irritation from the bit. It's basically little bone bruises that have happened, and then the body puts bone down. So you've got basically an osteophyte on the bar. But I'll show you some pictures. This one's my favorite one. Bits in backwards. And it's not just, your everyday amateur that's the problem. I mean, there's big time trainers that have gotten caught with the bits backwards. So the reason that's a problem is nowadays there's so many anatomical bits. If you put the bit in the opposite way that it's designed, it now becomes a very severe bit because it's the opposite of the anatomical relief that it's supposed to be providing. So always pay attention. If your bit has a little arrow on it, like the Hermspringer bit, some of the Neuschule bits have arrows, make sure that arrow is pointing forward and it's on the left-hand side. And some of the other bits may have numbers or something, like the turtle bits have a turtle in the middle. Don't turn the turtle upside down. Make sure the turtle's the right way around. Okay, just some basic things. But just, be mindful, especially if you've got a groom who's taking your equipment apart and putting bits back on, that it's in the right way. Just double check it, because it can really cause a problem and it can cause a lot of bruising in the mouth. Worn bits, this is also another one. I love going to some of the older, trainers that have been around for years and years, and they're like, oh, let me show you my bit box. And then here comes the bit box. And the links on the bits, these are metal, they wear out. So, but I get, oh, but it's my favorite bit. I've had it for years and years. I'm like, great, hang it on the wall now. It doesn't need to go back in a horse's mouth. And there's some of the brands now I'm seeing that are wearing, not some of the good companies, but a lot of the bits that are made in like Pakistan and the like, they're starting to wear after a few years, and the edges are getting quite sharp. So I'm not going to name any names, but it does happen. So just check your tack. Okay, so now we're going to have a look inside the horse's mouth. So we've opened the horse's mouth and we're looking straight in. And you can see at the top the canines, and these are quite large. These are probably in a gelding or a stallion, quite a big tooth. And one of the things is just to make sure that sometimes they get kind of sharp and they can cause some irritation on the tongue. So just make sure you're checking the tongue and making sure that that's not causing a problem. If it is, just talk to your dentist about it. You see the wolf teeth? This horse has wolf teeth still. Those normally come out. I have a coming 4-year-old that needs to happen. They need to come out. And the thing also, this horse has got a really good arch in the palate. But what's interesting in what I'm seeing now is like the palate low down towards the incisors is normally pretty flat. And some horses, that flatness stays back to where the bit is, and then after where the bit is, it starts to arch up. So that's something you've really got to pay attention to also. And these ridges, all the horses, kind of like fingerprints, they all have different shape ridges, different thicknesses, different widths. And those are of significance because where you place the bit in the horse's mouth, it's going to either hit one of those peaks or valleys. So let the horse tell you where it's comfortable, right? Because you may be hitting one of those ridges, and that may be putting a lot more pressure, because those things can be like, that big with some horses. So that's a pretty big space. Okay, so why can a bit affect how a horse moves? How can a bit change a horse? And Melissa and I have worked together, I don't know, like probably 5 years now or something. And worked with a lot of different horses, and it's really amazing sometimes what you see in how the horses change and all the way through their bodies. So why does that happen? It happens because, like I said before, all of these muscles are connected. And if you look at the orange highlighted area, those are the muscles on the underside of the horse's body. And you can see the tongue in the head connects in. You can barely see the hyoid bone up at the top of the cheek there. And you can see that is connected all the way through to the stifle. So we can change a bit, and I'm not saying that I'm not saying we're going to change the bit and the horse is going to have an amazing hind leg, because the horse is going to have a hind leg what it's given. But it can be something that's blocking it, or it's something that frees it up. So, and the same thing with the top line, especially with the bridle, with where the fascia and then the top line muscles start, you can have a big change as well. So pretty significant. And it's pretty interesting to see it. This is a actual photo of a skull. And if you imagine the horse's head is looking like his nose is to the right. So this is a unique skull because the hyoid is still attached. So our hyoid floats freely. The horse's hyoid is attached with little ligaments and cartilage, so it's still connected. So this is an area that is incredibly sensitive, because if you look where the ear canal is, do you all see that? If you've got a bridle that's digging into the back of your horse's ear, and you think about all of the connections that go into the hyoid structure, it's a lot of pressure that can really have a big impact the entire way through the horse's body. So, but like I said, bridle fit's a whole nother discussion, but this is all connected. Like the tongue is connected onto the hyoid. So there's so much going on. I call this area like Grand Central Station, right, of the horse. So this is just illustrating where you get a bridle, where you see where that's really pushing into the back of the ear. And this is my 2-second speech on bridles. I see so many anatomical bridles that do not fit a horse. I don't know what horse they were designed to fit, but they just don't fit. They've got a cute little cutout, but the cutout digs into the middle of the ear. So be very, very conscious of that. And just I wouldn't grab a bridle off the rack and just say, oh, this is great for my horse. I would have it professionally fit. So, and that's a big one. Okay, so we were talking about pretty cute little faces. This was one of my guys who's in London's program now. But he is he's absolutely adorable. Cute little dished face. When I first saw him in Germany, I thought, well, what are they doing with an Arabian in the barn? But he had kind of the typical mouth that I'm running into now, with pretty little muzzle, huge tongue. I just saw him on Sunday. His tongue is probably like that thick. You know, you see tongues and they start to get over 4 centimeters in thickness. If I fit your horse and I whip out the tape measure to measure the tongue, you know your horse has a big tongue. I think the thickest one I measured was like over 4¼ inches, just not inches, centimeters in height. I mean, that's thick. I mean, this guy was right up there. So it really creates a challenge with bit fitting. And so you see when you peel the lips back like that, when you see this oozing tongue, you know you're in for a bit of a challenge. Okay, so, and some of them are not that bad, but some of them it's like, whoa, okay. Okay, so this is an interesting photo, because this is a cross-section of a horse's nose that was done after the horse was autopsied, and they froze its head, and they took slices at various intervals, like stepping back towards the ears, and they left the bit in when they froze it, and then they sliced it. And it's interesting because if you can actually see the bit in there. So H is let's just say, for example, this is a KK Ultra, which is probably what it is. So the H is the middle lozenge of the KK Ultra. And so you see G is the tongue, F is the bar, or one of the bars, so you're going to have the other one on the other side. I'm sorry, E is the bar. So number one, there's no room in here when the horse's mouth is closed. It's pretty amazing, right? There's no room. It's not like our mouth. When we close our mouth and we've got a huge space between our tongue and the roof of our mouth. The other thing that's really remarkable to me is the asymmetry, right? I mean, you've all seen those pictures of human faces, right? Where they do, they split it in half and they do one side and then they replicate it and it looks like a completely different person. It's the same with the horse's mouth. So and you even look at the bottom where F is, like the height difference. So it's really sometimes a challenge, especially if you have a horse that's done something when they're younger. I like to say when they're younger, and probably even later, they like to commit suicide and homicide on a daily basis, right? So, I've had really lovely horses that ran into a tree or got kicked or something when they were young, so their head was uneven. And I had a really hard time with this horse turning him to the left. And when we finally figured it out, we realized that the left molars were higher, like the lower jaw was higher than the right side. So I had to figure out bitting to get around that. And the other thing is, there's things we can do with some of the companies where we can get bits custom made, where if they really are uneven, we can make one side thinner than the other side, so that the bit, especially with the curb, so it'll sit straighter. So, but this is a really important image to remember. Okay, so if you all go and Google flabby lips, this is what will come up. I couldn't find another technical term. So this is basically, if you peel the lip back, there's a mucosal flap that when the horse's mouth is closed, it slides over the bars. And some horses, it's really insignificant. It's barely there. Some horses, it's like a big chunk of flab that's in there. So especially when you start getting into draft crosses or some of the older Dutch and Hanoverian bloodlines, we'll see that quite a bit as well. So that can get bruised, can get discolored, and it just takes up a lot of space sometimes too. So I'll go find the flabby lips on your horses. Okay, this is something that makes me a little bit sad because I see it a lot. And these are bone spurs. So that jaw should be completely flat between the teeth. And you see those ridges and those bumps? Those are little osteophytes that have formed because the horse at some point has had damage from a bit. I see it a lot with horses coming off the track. And it's something that it can happen. You know, you work with, if you start young horses, you know, sometimes the first time you've got side reins on them or at some point early in their training, they panic and they do this and then they fight against it. That can be enough to cause a little bit of a problem, create a little chip that then hopefully the body absorbs that, but then you start to get these bumps that form. And then sometimes these bumps will fall out and then there's an indentation. And I've fit horses where they've had like big bumps on one side and the indentation on the other side. Upper level dressage horse, we've got to put a double bridle on it, what do? So I've had to really build up one side of the bit and have the other side thinner so that the bit will sit level in the horse's mouth or just not create uneven pressure on the side that's higher up. So that's something, and you can feel that. This is your other stick your fingers in the horse's mouth exercise. So if you stand in front of your horse, which you're not supposed to do, and then run your thumb up, and you're going to put your thumb up and down on the bar, and it should feel completely smooth and slick. You shouldn't feel any kind of indentation. And if you go up a little bit and you feel a little divot or you feel a little bump, then that's some kind of remodeling that's happened on the lower jaw. And there are ways we can bit around that. So if your horse has bone spurs, we can bit around it and get the pressure off that spot. So this is an example of a little bit of an injury that's starting to happen from a bit inside a horse's mouth. And this can be from a different material, or it can also be from these extreme anatomical bits if it's a little bit too small and it pushes the cheek in a little bit and it pushes it in and then it gets caught up between the bit and the first molar and you start to get these kinds of rubs and pinches going on. And this is an example of a pinch, and I see these, let's just say they're not uncommon. And again, that's the bit catching that mucosal tissue or the inside of the cheek. So it's getting caught between the bit and then that first molar. You can see the molar. Do you all see the molar there? So do you see also that molar does not have a bit seat? Can you see how it's like straight up and down? It's completely vertical. So let's just digress and talk for a moment about bit seats because that's kind of a hot topic right now as well. So the dental community in general, again, in general, I'm not a dentist, I'm not a vet, but in general, they are getting away or have gotten away from bit seats because there was too much aggression going on with the bit seats that were being put in the mouths. They're traditionally 45-degree angle. So if you look at the one that's there where it's straight up and down, now imagine that line goes back at 45 degrees, right? That's pretty aggressive. So what was happening was a lot of the times they were getting into the pulp of the tooth and it was killing the tooth. So then the dental community said, okay, bit seats are bad. We need to stop doing bit seats. Problem is, those of us that ride dressage or jump, I'll show you a slide in a second that talks about why this is important. When we take upper contact, that bit slides up in the mouth and it makes contact with the tooth. So if you don't have some kind of a bit seat, that bit is going to stop, is going to have a hard stop against that tooth and also catch tissue in there. So there needs to be either what we call a modified bit seat or a rostral profile is the technical term for it. So just that there's a little bit of a rounded edge there, so there's somewhere for the bit to slide a little bit in the tissue to get out of the way. Otherwise, you're going to see things like this. And you can see there's some damage there, low down. If you can see, it's not a very good photo, actually. That's from a tongue tie, or from a bit that somebody just lets the horse lay on their hands for the entire ride. So you think about it, you've got pressure, especially if you've got a straight bar bit, and if you're just if the horse is just hanging on your hand the whole time, right, that whole ride, there's no blood supply to that area, so you're going to have tissue dying off. So, but unfortunately, I see quite a lot of this from tongue ties. But this one looks like it's from a bit. And then that's one that's been pretty deep, that's healed over. And I actually had a horse I brought over from Europe, a nice Grand Prix horse, that had that, and it wasn't picked up in the vetting because they don't look in the mouth. So that's, I mean, the tongue's almost all the way cut through. So this is a photo that I took of a client horse at a clinic. And he was just this lovely kind of oversized pony. He had a lovely, delightful amateur owner, just super horse, like really healthy, really in great shape. The trainer and the rider brought the horse to the clinic and they said, you know, we just can't get him to turn left. He won't bend left, he won't turn left. And I opened up his mouth and I said, well, when was his dental done? They said, oh, it was a month ago he was done. So if you see where the red arrow is, that is the first upper, that's the premolar, the upper tooth. Do you see the hook? Wish I had my pointer. So that should be a 90-degree angle, that tooth, okay? And you see how it comes down? That's a hook. And then what they did was they just kind of took a little bit off the hook. And if you look at the lower tooth, the opposing tooth, do you see how the front of that's worn off? So this poor horse, when it closed its mouth, that hook literally locked its jaw. So it couldn't move, because normally when the horse comes down, you know, the lower jaw is able to slide up and down. That was just locked in place. It couldn't move. So I didn't do anything bit fitting with him. I said, okay, you need to go find a really good dentist and get that address, which they did. And then they came back and saw me 4 months later, and he was a different horse. Yeah, he was just, it was just so, I mean, basic. I mean, I opened his mouth and I had to look at it and say, what tooth is that? It took me a minute to kind of realize what it was, and then I saw, wow, this is a hook. So, but you see, I see this a lot with horses that the care is impeccable. I mean, they're in great shape physically, they look fantastic, but then you find something like this. Okay, let me think if there's anything else I wanted to talk about with this. I think the only thing I want to add is, and I'm sure here you got great resources for dental work. My recommendation, and there are exceptions, but my recommendation is you use a veterinarian who also has gone to dental school, who specializes in dentistry. Because I think you get into some extremes that are not ideal. Granted, there are exceptions, I know that, but I just always try to steer people in that direction because I know they're going to be safe that way. And the other thing too is when your dentist is there, try to be there and try to ask questions and have a look. Because oftentimes I find, you know, they're there to do their job, and they put the speculum in, they, you know, the horse is sedated, open up the mouth, and they go on and do their thing. They're not looking at the bars. They're not really looking inside the lips to see is there any damage or any pinches. So, you know, be there, ask questions, take the opportunity to, you know, when the horse is sedated, flip the lips over a little bit, have a look around, poke around, and see what's going on inside there. And, you know, because sometimes, you know, we'll even fit bits properly, and then horses change, and then things start to go on in the mouth, and we've got to do something differently. So just stay on top of it. Okay, so how do bits work? So bits work on the horse's head. A snaffle is primarily going to work just on the tongue and on the lower jaw. when you start adding leverage, like you add a curb chain with a leverage bit, like a curb bit, then you start to get pull, nuchal ligament leverage, as well as leverage on the underside of the mouth, and then you get more tongue pressure happening. And then when you're using like a hackamore or some of these bits that have an additional strap that goes over the nose, then you're getting the pressure on the nose. Okay, so now we get into bitting physics. Okay, so if you look at the red lines, okay, the red line that's up by the cheek piece, that line runs right down through the horse's mouth. That's where a bit is going to sit when there's no pressure on it, no rein pressure. Like if you just got a bridle hanging on a horse's head, that's where the pressure is going to be. It's all going to be in the lips, okay? Anytime we start adding rein pressure, the tongue line, that starts to come into play. Does that make sense? Okay? And I'll show you why. So the picture on the left without the reins, do you all see how the cheek piece is straight down aligned with the mouthpiece of the bit? Okay, do you want to guess how much pressure is on the lips at that point? Anybody want to guess? It's about 300 to 500 grams of pressure. It's the weight of the bridle, basically. It's on the pole and in the lips there. So when you take up the rein contact, do you see how the bit has now gone up in the mouth and down into the tongue? It's kind of gone like a C, okay? And also notice where the cheek piece is relative to the mouthpiece. That's significant when we start getting into different cheek pieces. So you see it's curved this way. And now you've got, like I said, more pressure on the tongue. And there's actually, when you do the bitting certification, they make you calculate it. There's a formula. I don't know who came up with the formula, but there's a way to calculate the pressure there. Okay, so double bridles. So you've got your bradoon, and that's going to work exactly the same as your snaffle. So that's going to rotate which way? Everybody? Exactly. What about your curb? Correct. So when you pick up the rein contact, just take a look at that. You take up the rein contact, it's going to go, the rein's going to go that way. So you've got a fulcrum point now. You've got a mouthpiece in the middle, and you've got a small shank above the bit. So that small shank is going to rotate forward towards the horse's nose. So the bradoon and the curb work opposite directions. And that's important too when you place the bits in the mouth. Okay, so what are the things that we need to consider for correct bit fitting? I always say number one most important thing is the mouthpiece shape. And that relates to the anatomy of the horse. Or do they have bone spurs? Or do they have, different things that are going on in the horse's mouth? So number one is the mouthpiece shape. Horse gets to pick that. So the next thing is the thickness. And that is very much related to how fleshy their mouth is, how thick the tongue is, how fleshy the palate is. And one of the things that I'm running into, I'm starting to see more and more, and it's breeding related, is now the palates of some horses, they're not just flat or arched like this. Now I'm starting to see them, I call it like a hanging ceiling. Now they're starting to curve a little bit downwards. So Hermspringer was in Wellington a few weeks ago, and I said, you guys have to come and see this one horse, because I said, this is a tough one. And, the German guys come in, they're like, okay, let's get this right. And guy puts his finger in the mouth, and he's the head of Hermspringer, and he looks at me, and his eyes go like this. He goes, how did you put a double bridle on that horse? But it's, again, it's breeding related. So, and I don't know what we can do about that. I don't think the breeders are going to change that. The cheek piece of the bit is important. That can be, again, related to the skill level of the rider how sensitive the horse is. Does the horse not like something moving around? Does the horse want something quiet? Do we need more lateral control? Do we need to be able, is this a young horse that does not know how to turn well? Are we jumping tight courses and we need that help from either a full cheek or from a D-ring? So the cheek piece, I say the rider picks. I mean, that's a generalization, but mouthpiece, horse picks, cheek piece, we get to pick, sort of. And then the size, that's the other thing, the width. And what's interesting is, again, is the shapes of the mouth, the fleshiness of the mouths are changing. I find sometimes a horse may measure, 5 1/4, and the horse is better in a 5-inch bit because they've got really elastic, stretchy lips. So if I put them in a bigger bit, too much of the bit sliding through the mouth because they just have elastic, supple lips. So that's the other thing too I didn't mention is when you kind of pull on the corner of the horse's mouth, some horses you feel it stops, and then some it just keeps going because they're so elastic. So those are things as well that you really have to take into account. Okay, so mouthpieces. We'll go through this as well. So those of us that have been riding for a few years, we only had, back in the day, it was only single jointed bits, right? And then I think KK was the one, Hermspringer came out with the double jointed bit. And it was supposed to be the anatomical game changer. And it was. It really, I think, started us thinking about bit fitting pretty much with that KK bit. And you can see how differently the two shapes lay in the mouth. If you look at the single joint first, and you can see that the pressure is more on the side of the tongue and on the edge of the lips, and then also gives the horse more tongue freedom. You don't have as much pressure on the tongue. And I think lately, and probably since KK came out with the bit, there's been the feeling is, well, single jointed bits are harsh, there's a nutcracker effect. And I really disagree with that because I have a lot of horses that do really, really well in single jointed bits and actually prefer it, especially if you have a horse that's very busy, the busy chompy ones. They don't like that lozenge or that pressure in the middle of the tongue. But again, it's preference. They're all different, the shapes are different, their nerves are different. So you really have to listen to what the horse is telling you. But you can see how it really, the double jointed bit really lays differently in the mouth, puts pressure on different structures, takes pressure away from different areas. So really a big difference between the two. I think we kind of covered that already. So you get a wider surface area of pressure on the middle of the tongue. But you can also see, remember in the beginning I talked about the length of the lozenge, right? If you've got a big lozenge, this shows you, look, 4 of the bars. If you've got a big lozenge, now the links of that double jointed bit are sitting right over the tongue where the bars are. So you're adding a lot of thickness and a lot of pressure right on the bars. So the bars are going to push up underneath the tongue, and that's going to create quite a bit of pressure. So the smaller links are really important. Don't want to see big lozenge links. And again, it's the off-brands that do that. So this is interesting because on the right is the original KK design. And I bet some of you still have that bit in your bit box. So it's not designed to have a 45-degree angle of the lozenge or of the rings in the middle. And you can see the original design on the right versus the KK Ultra, which has the 45-degree angle. And if you go look at the KK bit on the tag on it, it talks about a 45-degree angle. And this is why it's of significance, because you see how the bit lays flatter on the tongue. And in laying flatter on the tongue, it's now taking up less room in the mouth. We all know now how incredibly jammed full of stuff a horse's mouth is, so we don't want to put more stuff in there, right? We want to try and have the bit in there laying on the horse's tongue, and not putting pressure on the palate. Because remember, you also have bones on the upper jaw that these rings on the right-hand side are going to be pushing into. So anatomical features are important, or really much smaller links. Okay, so we talked about that. Okay, so these x-rays are interesting because this shows you how the bits are laying on the narrowest part of the jaw. Remember homework assignment was stick your finger and your thumb under the tongue and feel how narrow that is. You can see very little of the bit actually is laying on top of where there's bone, right? So and this just shows some different shapes. The snaffle bit 1 it's got a little bit of a bend to it, and you can see how that lays and how it's a little bit softer on the bars than the example 4, which is the straighter version of the single joint. Can you see the difference? And you can see how that's going to have a sharper action on the bars and on the tongue and on the lips than example 1. And the same with the double jointed bits on the right-hand side, the snaffle 2 versus snaffle 3. You can see the straighter cannons, the bars and the bit are called cannons because it looks like a cannon, I guess. So you can see the straighter one has much less, has more pressure, more angular pressure on the structures of the mouth versus the one on the bottom that's got extreme bending to it. And can you all see these x-rays? So if you look at the left-hand series of x-rays that really highlight, this is just a single joint, it really highlights the point here. Can you see the red lines? Can you all see those? Okay, so that's where a bit is sitting with no pressure. Okay, 0, there's no rain contact. Okay, the second, the FR equals 20, that's when you've got 2 kilograms of force on the reins. And you can see the bit has moved up in the horse's mouth because you see the red lines are shorter. You all see that? And if you look at the bottom, that's now 4 kilograms of force, and you can see the bit is right up against those teeth. That's why I was saying, number one, the shape of the bit is really important, matching the anatomy. If you have a horse that's got molars that are low in its mouth, then you have to be really careful about what you're putting in the mouth because that bit's going to hit those teeth really quickly. But also think about 4 kilograms of force is not a whole lot of weight. Right? If you're out on cross country, I suspect that we're probably using a little bit more than that in certain moments. Just put it that way. Okay. So, and then the one on the right is just showing a double jointed bit, same thing. But you see how much that bit slides up, and then it doesn't take a whole lot of pressure for that to be coming into contact with the tooth. So that's why, again, the modified bit seat is so important. Okay, so let me just quickly run through some different types of bits, and this is, I just wanted to pull some random bits just to give you an idea of what they are. So the KK Ultra, we talked about that a little bit already. That's got that 45-degree rotation. And the significance of the 45 degrees is when the horse is on the bit with its nose vertical and the bit is engaged, like you've got the contact is good, the bit is going to, remember the bit rotates. So when that bit rotates at 45 degrees is where it's engaged and where it's laying on the tongue. That's why when they have a 45-degree rotation on the bit, it's going to lay flat on the horse's mouth. Okay, and then we also said there's some bar pressure from that bit because the cannons are straight. Okay, so we get into the Hermspringer Dynamic RS type and also the Norschule Team Up. I can use my, it doesn't work on there. So do you see the cannons are a little bit more bent? They're a little bit more curved. So that curvature is going to soften the pressure on the bars and on the edges of the tongue. So it's a little bit of a softer acting bit. If you put that bit on your arm, it's just going to drape very evenly around your arm. It's a really, really good bit. And then the next example I wanted to give, this is one of the bomber bits, the elliptical dressage control. You see there's a lot more curvature there. So if you imagine that in a horse's mouth, the pressure is going to lay across the tongue, right? You have very little pressure squeezing down on the bars. But when you get into the bends like this, you have to be a little bit careful because they can start to create that pinch that we saw inside the mouth. So Ballmer's was very clever with the design of these ultra comfy snaffles, because if you look at the single joint at the bottom, they're the exact same bit, one's double joint, one's single joint. Do you see how the cannon doesn't come away from the cheek piece at 90 degrees? It curves up. So in doing that, combined with the little links, they have little 5mm links in the middle, the horse has a lot of tongue relief. There's a lot more room for the tongue without putting pressure up on the palate. Really clever design. And then if you go all the way for tongue relief, you go to what they call a happy tongue. And that's a bit that gives plenty of room for the tongue. And again, a very clever design. The middle portion of that bit, they put in a press and they actually squash it down to like 10mm. So it's flat, so you're not putting pressure at all. You've got a ported bit that's not putting pressure on the palate. That bit, when it's engaged, is going to lay into the tongue and be level, so there's no pressure on the palate. And the way that this bit curves a little bit forward, you don't have the pressure on the bars. Because again, remember basic physics, if you take pressure away from one area, it has to go somewhere else. So if you see a bit that doesn't have the forward curvature like that, like just a regular ported type bit, that's putting pressure on the bars. Pressure on the palate and then down on the bars. Okay, so types of snaffle bits. I think you all know this. We've got the loose ring bit, we've got an egg butt, and we've got a full cheek. And they all work a little bit differently. How are we all doing out there? How many fingers do we still have? Okay, what was that? Soon to be less, yeah. All right, so loose ring snaffles. Let's talk about different snaffle bits. Now, when I go out to do my clinics, and the owner comes out and they start to tell me, well, I had my horse in an egg butt and he hated it. Or I had my horse in a loose ring and he hated it. And I kind of look at them and go, okay, let's start with mouthpieces, right? Like we talked about, horse gets to pick that. Anyway, so let's talk about loose rings. So loose rings are going to create pressure directly onto the tongue. There's no leverage action on the crown. And the thing that I think a lot of horses like about the loose ring snaffle is it moves independently and it can place on their tongue wherever their anatomy is letting it. And I think as a rider, a lot of riders like the feeling of a loose ring because it gives you a really quick in and out, and especially the out, the release in the half halt is quick. So you get a little bit of a clear off-on. At least that's the feeling. Melissa, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but it's just, to me, you get a little bit more suppleness, a little bit more looseness in it. But again, it depends on the horse. Some horses need that. Some horses don't need that. Okay, so some horses need a fixed cheek for a variety of reasons. Sometimes, well, let me just say this. You have a more direct rein aid with a full cheek, with an egg butt or a full cheek snaffle, because that mouthpiece is set to the cheek piece. So when you take up rein contact, it's a direct action on the tongue. And also the horse cannot move it. So that can be a good thing or that can be a bad thing, depending on the horse and depending on the rider. So it's also a really good option for horses that tend to pinch. You get the ones that in the corner, they pinch or they rub. The other good thing about a fixed cheek is you get more lateral influence. You get more turning because especially with the young horse, right? You're going around, you're trying to get them to turn left, right? Well, if you open the left rein, then they're going to get pressure on the right side, and that helps them turn the head and helps them understand to turn. And then the other thing is the egg butt, like I said, is also good for horses who are sensitive, really hot horses, like that react to everything. The bit's just a little bit quieter. That can be a better thing for them. It's also good for horses that play with the bit. They like to and move everything around. It can be a little bit quieter. And it's also really good for horses that tend to want to fall through the shoulder. You have a hard time turning and they're always just a little bit like a wiggle worm. It's also very good for a rider who maybe isn't as independent in their seat yet as they will become. Or if they're unsteady, they're a bit off and on with the connection, because that will stabilize things in the horse's mouth. So the horse is not feeling that as much as they would with a loose ring. And then the other thing is, remember we talked about the rotation of the bit when you take up the rein? When you get to a D ring, you don't get that rotation. And that's where I need my assistant for a second. So we brought this is a D egg butt. So if you look at, remember we looked at this. So the bit, remember the bit is going to rotate that way when you take up the rein contact. When you have a D ring, it stops some of that rotation. Do you all see that? Right, and especially when you get into a true D ring, you know, especially the jumper ones, or the 100 jumper ones, you only can rotate that bit to a point and it stops. So then you get into the question of, okay, so now the bit's designed at 45-degree angle to lay on the horse's tongue. So now if it's limiting that, that's working a little differently on the horse's tongue. So just something to consider. It does, the cheek piece will change how that mouthpiece interacts with the horse's mouth. My other favorite topic is the Bowsher bit. Okay, everybody's familiar with the Bowsher, right? Why do we use a Bowsher? Anybody want to jump in?
Pole pressure.
Say again?
Pole pressure.
What about pole pressure? Okay, why? How? Okay, so no, you're exactly right. And I'm really glad you jumped in and said that, because that is exactly the thought behind the bit. Okay, basic physics. Okay, if you don't have a lever below your fulcrum, how do you have leverage? You don't. We didn't bring one. We should have brought one. So Neuschuler did a very interesting study. They put sensors on the crown piece, and they measured how much pressure the different bits created. And they have there's a whole list of all the different bits. And I pulled this out with the Bowsher because up to 3 kilograms of rein pressure, so that's quite a bit of rein pressure, right? It actually relieves the pole pressure. It does the opposite. And the reason is, let's take the double bridle. So basically, with the Bowsher bit, or the bochet, as some people call it, you have a curb without the shank, right? Just to make it pretty basic. And which way did that rotate? It rotates that way, right? Okay. So, yeah, it does rotate that way to about there. And what happens in that moment, I wish we had a horse that we had this on, but you can try, if you've got a friend that's got one on their horse, try this. Pull on the reins a little bit, and it goes to this point and it stops. And where it stops, the cheek pieces are billowing now. Okay? So it's relieving pole pressure, and you can't go past that point because you have no lever below the fulcrum. Does that make sense? You didn't know you were coming to a physics class tonight, right? It's fascinating. So it goes to a certain point, and then it stops, and then you increase the rein pressure, and now that bit comes directly down onto the tongue, lower down in the mouth. That's where you get the reaction. So it's not so much the pole pressure, it's, I think, that reaction on the tongue. But again, you look at all these anatomically designed bits that are available in Bowshers, and they're working in the opposite way, right? They're not rotating into that 45-degree angle laying on the tongue. So my theory is, thank you. My theory is that these horses do better in these bits for 2 reasons. One, it's essentially a floating bit because it's not coming down onto the tongue like a normal snaffle would. So if the horse didn't like its mouthpiece and now you put him in a Bowsher, you're taking that uncomfortable pressure away from them, so they're happier, they go better, okay? And then number 2 is when you go past that 3 kilograms of pressure, and now that bit comes down onto the tongue, and now you've got a really strong action on the horse. So I think it's one of those two reasons why that bit works in situations. Interesting thing is I travel with about 300 bits, and I'm at the point I've quit traveling with the Bauschers. I don't even have them in my suitcase anymore because I always have found another bit that the horse is happy in. I've gotten them out of that because the problem with the Bauscher, with that fixed cheek, the way it is set, you lose all your lateral suppleness and adjustability. So it's, again, it comes back to find the right mouthpiece that's more suitable for the horse and the horse's anatomy. That's an interesting one. So the leverage bits, your Weymouth, your Pelham, and your Kimberwick, they're going to act on the pole. That's where you start to get pole pressure. When that curb bit rotates and the curb chain engages, that's when the pole pressure is limited. As much as the curb is rotating, that's when you're getting increasing pole pressure. When the curb chain engages, when the bit is hopefully at 45 degrees, not at 90 degrees, right? That's when the tongue is engaged. And when you see these bits rotate past 45 degrees, now again, you're past the point where these mouthpieces are designed to lay on the horse's tongue, right? And looser curb chains are not friendlier. Okay, types of materials. I would say in the last 15 years, there's been an absolute explosion in the type of designs of bits, materials used. I mean, we're seeing all kinds of things. But the most common ones I've just listed here. Each brand, the major brands, I'm not talking about the off brands, but the major brands like Sensigen is the metal, the alloy that Herm-Sprenger uses. And they used to do Oregon and then German silver, but now they're using Sensigen. They feel that that's a better alloy to use, and it's got a manganese content in it, which they say releases the entire time that it's in contact with the horse's mouth, so it's stimulating salivation the entire ride, versus a higher copper content, which you get an initial hit, an initial reaction with the saliva, and then it kind of tapers off. That's their theory. The Salox is what Neuschule uses, and that's been a very successful metal for them. It's got a little bit of a higher copper content, and they say that metal warms up to the horse's mouth like almost immediately, so it makes it more palatable for the horse, that they're not getting a cold bit. Good old sweet iron is actually a pretty good choice for a lot of horses. They like the fact that the oxidization creates that sweet taste for them, and if you have a horse that's got a dry mouth, that can sometimes be a game changer for them, to go to a sweet iron. Those bits will rust if you don't take care of them, but they're easy to clean up. And I get calls from people, you sold me a bit that's rusting. It's supposed to do that. Titanium's become really popular, and I think in my experience, there's a small percentage of horses that go better in titanium. It's a non-reactive metal versus the other three that we've talked about already. But it's lighter weight, and some of these more sensitive horses, the lighter weight, if you hold up a double bridle, that can be pretty heavy, right? And if you put titanium bits on, it can be a lot less pressure on the pole. And for some horses, that's really a game changer. So I've seen some do really, really well going to the titanium, but it's not every horse. And I see people out there with, oh, I got this titanium bit, and like, no, it's not. Some horses, I think, they're not as aware of the bit because it's so light, and then you use it and then they get offended because they're not feeling it in their mouths all the time. But again, it's the individual horse. Plastic, there's some pretty good plastic options out there now. Some really interesting shapes, and then rubber. One of the things with rubber you have to be mindful of is rubber is not completely smooth like metal. It's a little bit abrasive. So one of those pictures that I showed you earlier on from the tongue could have been from a rubber bit, because it just gets a little bit abrasive. Stainless steel, Again, it's not reactive in the mouth, so they're cost effective, but not always the best choice for that reason. And copper used to be very popular, but the problem with copper is it's not very strong, and it can actually break easily. Like if a horse bolts with you and you guys are holding on for dear life, that bit can actually break. And then of course there's other alloys out there as well. So, big question, how do you choose the correct size? Okay, so this is just oh, sorry, that's not that. So in general terms, you want to go 1/4 inch larger than the measurement of the horse's mouth for a loose ring. I'm saying in general because I find that this varies a lot. But if you're on your own, you're trying to do the best you can do with sizing a bit, this is a good guide. For your fixed cheek, normally it's the same size as the mouth or just slightly bigger. If your horse is like 4 7/8, I would go with a 5 inch. I wouldn't go necessarily down unless you've got somebody, a professional fitter working with you. The curb, I've been around a long time riding horses, and I was always taught your curb bit should be 1/4 inch smaller than your snaffle bit. And that was kind of the hard and fast rule. And now that's really changed. Again, when you go and feel how narrow that lower jaw is, how close together those bars are, you'll see the important thing is to fit the bit where the upper shanks are just a little bit snug on the jaw, not pushing into the cheeks, but just laying there. You shouldn't see a big piece of the mouthpiece sticking out the side of the mouth, because then you start getting into that bit rocking. Because remember how narrow that lower jaw is. So just snug enough that your curb chain hooks aren't going to cause any pressure on the lips, because there is a bit of a trend out there for curbs to be fit a lot smaller, and then I see the horses come to me with they've actually got wounds from now the curb chain hooks because it's pushing too much on them. So this little blue measurer is a little handy device if you've got a tack store around here that has them. I like to put a bit guard on. It just helps you slide the bit guard on the other side so you can hold it with your fingers and then get an idea. At least, like I said, it gives you an idea. You may need to adjust up or down if you've got a horse that's got super stretchy lips. You may just want to go a little bit more on the snug side. And then, like I said, with the curb, that's going to be based on the size of the lower jaw. So the other thing with your horse is when you look at your horse, and hopefully you have 10 fingers still at that point, look at the difference between the upper jaw and lips, and then put your hand underneath and feel the size of the lower jaw. Some horses, the lower jaw is tiny. Some, it's almost the same size as the top, or it looks that way. But some of them, the lower jaws are really tiny. Okay, how to correctly measure a snaffle bit. And I put this in because I find this tremendous variation of interpretation of how to measure bits. So when you're measuring the size of a bit, you want to measure the actual mouthpiece. You don't include the cheek pieces. You just measure, like with a loose ring, you're going to pull it open and you're going to measure the distance between the rings when you lay it flat. Okay? Not the holes, but the rings. The egg butt is going to be, again, the mouthpiece, not including the cheek piece. The thickness is the widest point of the widest part of the bit, right by the rings. And then the ring size is the millimeter diameter of the ring. Typically your bradoons are 50-55, your regular snaffles are 70-75 rings. And then sometimes some of the companies have pony rings, which are like 65. Typically it's inside, but I mean, you're gonna know if it's a bradoon or a snaffle. Yeah, that's why I'm saying 50-55, 70-75, somewhere in there. So that's how to measure a snaffle. And I'm doing this because I see riders, international riders, who say to me, I want to order this size bit, and then I get them the bit, and that's the wrong bit, that's not what I ordered. I said, how did you measure it? And they show me, and they're including the shanks, and it's creative measuring. Okay, so to measure a curb, it's the same thing. You measure the mouthpiece between the shanks. You don't include the shanks. Okay? And then the shank length is the length of the shank below the mouthpiece, not the entire piece, which is the cheek piece. Okay, does that make sense? Because these are the problems I run into when people call me. Okay, so this is a question I get all the time too. How do you know what height the bit should be adjusted to? I can't tell you how many horses come into sessions and they're smiling because the bit's so high. And then the rider says, well, but if I put it lower, the cheek pieces are loose. I'm like, well, that's meant to be that way. So you want to go, generally, we say a big wrinkle and a small wrinkle, or a wrinkle and a half. We don't want to, in a snaffle, I don't want to see 3 wrinkles or more. And I see it. And the bit's just too high. And the reason that that's important is because then when you release at the end of your half halt, the horse gets no relief, right? It's constant pressure on the side of, on the edge of its lips. Okay, so for a correctly adjusted double bridle, you are going to put the bradoon a little bit higher. You may see 3 wrinkles with a double bridle bradoon because you have to make room for the curb. And this is where we start running into problems sometimes now, is that there's just not enough room to get a curb in there without the curb hitting the canine tooth. So, but this is how the double bridle should look. And I've got some examples of how it shouldn't look. So this was actually a client photo that was sent to me, and they said, does this look correct? Do you see the photo on the right? So when you fit double bridle bits, they should not touch, right? Because, okay, so let's say this is I think that bradoon is a 14 millimeter, and that curb is 16 millimeter. Or no, it's 13. So now we're up to what, 27 millimeters, right? Did I do my math correctly? So now you've got, we talked about how there's no room, and now you've put 2 bits on top of each other. So now you're putting tremendous pressure on the tongue and all the structures inside the mouth and on the palate. So really, really important that these lay properly. And I don't know if you can see this, but these bits are close, but there's separation between the 2. Okay. And you see where the canine is, we've actually got plenty of room. We could actually go a little bit lower. But again, let the horse tell you where it's comfortable. So I always say start with the bit a little lower in the mouth, and the horse will be like, at first, and then adjust it up a hole at a time on each side until the horse goes quiet. Okay? And what else was I going to say about that? Oh, one comment I wanted to make, because I run into this also on the bridles. A lot of the bridles now are an integrated crown where everything is stitched into one crown where you don't have the straps that move. So when you have a bridle like that, always put the bridle on and adjust your noseband first. Make sure your noseband is on the same hole on both sides, not like the 3rd hole on one side and the 4th hole on the other side. Because what happens with all of those straps connected in on top, if your noseband is crooked, now you're never going to get your bits level, right? Because it's just now twisted the bridle a little bit. So always start with the noseband, make sure that's on the same hole, and then you go ahead and adjust your bit. Because if you do it the other way around, get your bits kind of where they are, and then do up the noseband, you're going to have a completely wonky bridle up on the top, and a horse is not happy. And the other thing I'll say about bridles too, a lot, especially with double bridles, if any of you are using double bridles, now what they're doing is making the curb cheek piece longer than the snaffle, than the bradoon strap. And those of you that are great and take your bridles apart and clean them, which I know you all do every day, not kidding, those cheek pieces get put back on the wrong way around. And I've seen it where you've got 2 long ones on one side, 2 short ones on the other side, or the long ones on the snaffle on one side, and it's all mixed up. Just pay attention to that, and also pay attention to which straps they're on. The different companies have their bridles designed so the noseband goes on a particular strap and then the cheek pieces are on different straps. So they're all a little bit different, so just pay attention to that because, again, that can really change where the buckle is sitting in relation to the eye. It's way more complicated than back in the day. Okay, so again, just quickly with a double bridle, showing the 45-degree angle on the curb. The only way you can tell that a curb is correctly adjusted is when that curb chain engages at 45 degrees. You cannot tell by pulling on the curb chain, putting your hand under the curb chain. It's when you physically rotate the curb and see when that's engaging that curb chain. Okay. Okay, remember we talked about this at the beginning. Bits that are anatomical are going to have something that indicates that the bit needs to be in the right way around. This is a Hermsprenger, so it's got the arrow. Some of the Neuscholler bits have that as well. The Balmer bits I work with have numbers, the sizes are lasered on the side. So just make sure, please, that the anatomical bits are in the right way around or it's going to cause a big problem. And we talked about bridle fit already there. Just talking about some of the, this is actually a really nice bridle that I work with quite a bit. And you can see it fits really nicely on the horse's head, but that's a whole nother presentation. That's a Schockermüller Stanford. And now you have all this knowledge and you have your horses wonderfully on the bit. Do any of you have any questions? Yes? On the full cheek Stanfords, some people debate keepers or no? I think that's something you just have to, it's a personal thing. You know, I mean, you got to be a little bit. Yes. So on a full cheek snaffle, a full cheek or a fulmer, because there's a slight difference between the two, do you use a little keeper or no? The keeper is also going to stop that bit rotating like we talked about. I think that's a personal preference. The thing with those bits you have to be careful about is, especially young horses, they like to hook themselves on things. So from a safety standpoint, you have to be a little careful. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned the bridles. What do you think of the Myler bit line, the toe-clap Myler?
The Myler bits, I think, again, you know, there's a place for certain horses. I use a couple of them. You know, when I started my business, I got with all the different manufacturers and bought way too many bits. And then started to work through them, and I let the horses tell me what was working, and I have a couple that I work with from that collection, but I have better solutions.
Actually, I had a question about Milo. Like, what is a good application for a Milo? Like, what type of for
Again, you have to look at the variety of mouthpieces. It varies tremendously. You know, it's like saddles. You know, just because it's a brand doesn't mean each one is the same.
Saddle or copper version of that mouthpiece or titanium version of that mouthpiece?
There's such a wide variety of mouthpieces from them. You know, it just depends on the horse. I mean, I can't tell you, you know, a Milo is good for this type of horse because you'd have to look at, well, is it the level 2 and is it the egg butt or is it the loose ring or. It's all different. Sorry, that's a very vague answer, but that's kind of how it is. Well, that's the metal. Mylars are stainless steel. They're made from stainless steel. Then they have little copper inlays in them. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
I noticed in the picture of the double bridle that the curb hook is faced forward. And I think I might be getting that wrong. Does that cause the curb chain to weigh flatter?
I'd have to see the bit because they get bent and there's different types of curb chain hooks. Okay. Yeah. they're easy to get kind of caught and squished and moved around, but I would have to see it to answer that question. Yes?
What is your opinion on bit guards?
Bit guards, I think I hate to keep saying this, it depends on the situation of the horse. I think that they can be really good, especially in a cross country or a jumping application, because it will help, the bit not pull through the mouth as easily. And for some horses that rub, they can be a great solution. So they're just not legal for dressage, but you guys can use them for other applications. But I think for the right application, they're good. Anything else? One more, two more.
Are you able to, through your bit fitting, help horses who blow their tongue out? Is that something that you've found?
Oh my gosh, the tongue.
Jan's horse.
The tongues. So here's my speech on tongues. Yes, we can do some things that might work. The problem is it's twofold. One, once a horse develops the habit, it's a hard one to fix sometimes. Number two, it can be an indication of something going on in the horse's body. There's something, remember we talked about the subclinical issues? It oftentimes can be something else going on in the back, or the horse just isn't through enough in the training yet. Strength, something, but the horse has learned that he can do that and get away from the tongue pressure. So I think that's kind of the best way to answer that question. Yeah. Yes?
A similar question. If a horse, say, you're retraining, likes to root down into the bit, what's your concept of shifting to a hackamore to try to override that type of
I don't think that's not. At hackamore, you're avoiding the connection. Yeah, and again, I'd have to see the horse to be able to.
using a hackamore?
That's not an avenue I would go down, but I would have to see the horse to understand it. Anything else? Yes.
What's the point of having two bits in dressage?
So the double bridle is a refinement of the aids for a trained horse, a fully trained horse, and it allows you to apply a much more subtle aid. And the two bits work in different ways in the mouth. The Bridoon is working like your snaffle, like we showed there, where it comes down and you have pressure higher up in the mouth, on the tongue, and on the bars. And the curb gives you leverage in the pole, and then also pressure on the tongue when that curb chain engages. So the bits work differently, can give you the ability to, I think, stabilize the horse in a more up frame. And like I said, it's a refinement of the aids.
Should be.
Should be, yeah. It's not always used for that, though. But that's the politically correct answer. Anything else? Okay, well, great. I hope that helps you all, and thank you.